just feels tight.
Hey everyone, so thank you for joining us. So originally scheduled was Dejan Mladenovski, the Macedonian machine. He was originally going to talk about programmatic SEO, and I was super psyched about it because he was hyping it up for mums, like say, oh, you can't wait, I'm going to do a talk in Chiang Mai, I'm going to talk in Sydney, it's going to be great, you're going to love it. And yeah, unfortunately he's not here, so like, in classic speaker fashion, they're like, Peter, do you have a deck ready to go? And I'm like, yeah, I've got a deck ready to go. So today we're going to be talking about, well, if the slides are going to come up. Oh, there we go. We're a little bit too far. Thank you, thank you. That's spoiler alert. We're going to be talking about headless SEO. So the future of like web development, it's not really much of a future because we're in 2025 now. It's been a thing for a while. And it's something that I feel like there's very, very low literacy within the SEO community, particularly the technical SEO community, because a lot of people are self-starters. They start with WordPress, those kind of things. But when you work on bigger and bigger websites and more complicated organizations with multiple departments, or even like web developers who work on exciting technology, this is something that you might want to be across so that you can have the linguistic ability to communicate with stakeholders and other departments in order to succeed. So let's get started. We're going to talk about a few things in this presentation. We're going to talk about like what is a headless CMS, the difference between API-driven architecture versus the traditional monolithic structure. Those words sound scary, but means basically something that's split apart versus something that's all in one area. And then we're going to also give our SEO perspective on like how all this can work. So let's get started. So this is something that you should be all familiar with, even if you don't understand what the diagram is. This is a traditional monolithic platform. Think about WordPress, think about Magento, think about any system that you would use. Essentially, the server, which is a giant, powerful computer that lives in some kind of hosted environment, will host your backend code, which is your database, and anything that contains any business logic. Then you have your front-end code. That's the one that controls the presentation of the website and the HTML. So when a user accesses your website, they load up the page and they get the HTML. And that is what they see when they see the website. Everything is all in one structure. And you can see there are a bunch of platforms. These were e-coms specific with this original presentation. But this has its own set of problems as well because everything's all in the same place. So for example, when we did SEO for Suzanne Group way back in the day, they owned SportsGirl. And SportsGirl was a Magento website. And they were like, do not edit the CMS during our business hours because the website will have traffic and it's too slow, so Magento backend will be really slow to log in. That's all because everything was on the same place. The backend, the front end, they're all hosted in the same area, so when you actually had users on a website, you couldn't change anything on the website. Or if the website went down, the backend went down. There's limitations with that, and also everything's living in the same platform, so making a change is like a massive business decision. Where engineering is going to in the future, and where it is actually now in certain areas and certain business cases, is what is known as headless. This is the separation of the front from the back. You can essentially have the same front-end architecture and change the back-end and underlying technology and still have the same website, just make it upgraded without a hitch. So the back-end code could be in something like PHP. You could switch it to something fancy and new like Go with a whole sorts of different engineering challenges. And if you kept the front end the same, nothing would change for the user except for a faster website. And that the user still ends up with HTML code, it's just decoupled, it's split up. That is the engineering benefits of going headless, and it separates areas of concern so that you can have more sophisticated web applications. So in general, by definition, you're decoupling everything. So you might have, say for e-commerce, your inventory may come from one place. Your location data might come from another. You might have an events subscription to an API that will tell you like what sporting events are on. These are technologies that you can just purchase or integrate or those kind of things, and you could plug it all into the same front end. So this is all driven by APIs. APIs are application programming interfaces. These allow developers to make queries and requests to get data and information to fuel website content. So a list of things, a list of events, a list of products, a list of everything. Whereas monolithic ones, everything's all built in. Like you can use a WordPress website, it can be all built in, but if you had to integrate it, you better pray it as a plugin, or you have engineers to build custom plugins, but you're constantly working against a system, and you can't build truly scalable, world-class applications on WordPress. You can't build Airbnb on WordPress. You might be able to build a good clone, it might be serviceable for you, but it's a very different and a real hardcore, top-level application experience. So that's the definition, is one has flexibility, the other one is simple. Like SEO on WordPress is simple because WordPress is simple. Like WordPress is very, very clear what you can and can't do. One is scalable and one is integrated. So you can scale up different backends, you can do code splitting, you can take in like 100,000 million people in your website and split the database into this country and that country and do all this sophisticated stuff that engineers do to make sure websites can scale with a headless platform. If you did that on one giant WordPress website running on like one piece of software, I know like Ahrefs has like a giant server in Singapore, so they might be the people who like would say you don't need to go this complicated. But that's why AWS, which is Amazon's web services, is so popular, is because we have different technological challenges, and these are solutions is by having different technologies plug into the same thing to reduce the actual web application experience. And also, headless allows developer freedom. In WordPress and other technology platforms, you're stuck on PHP. You have to work within the language restrictions, so and you can only use WordPress developers or PHP developers. Whereas some developers like to use a language called Go, or they like to use Rust, or they like to use Node.js and those kind of things. This can allow you to use multiple technologies to power the back end, but the front end will just be a combination of all that information to produce what is the actual website. So, here are the pros and cons. Nothing is perfect. Everything has its challenges. There's no such thing as a best thing. I'm not going to say headless is better for SEO than WordPress or like a monolithic system. That is a ridiculous assertion. The benefits, flexible, scalable, future-proof, and the reason why it's future-proof is you can swap parts out. And essentially omni-channel delivery. So you don't have to actually have it for a web application. The same backend can power your iPhone app, your Android app, your smart fridge application, I guess, your television app, for example. The same backend can produce multiple front ends, or you can change the backend to power the same front end. The challenge though is that it's complicated. You actually need many, many subject experts. You need people who understand like information architecture. When you watch Silicon Valley, you see those team of engineers doing some weird applications working on Huli. This is the kind of stuff that where you work on big projects, big applications. It requires complicated organizational challenges, let alone technological challenges. There's also the initial setup, which is really, really difficult. There's essentially like content previews and setups. There's stuff that we take for granted out of the box, things like sitemap generation and like previewing of publishing content, those kind of things. It's very, very tricky on a custom web application because it's custom, so it's up to you as an SEO, if you're in the beginning of the project, to actually define how to have the SEO mechanisms that we all take for granted. So there's pros though, like you have greater control of the HTML output. You can reuse parts. If you know what you're doing, you can create the best SEO system you can. And also, you can have reusable elements and templates. I have a very special thing that populates SEO throughout any page. So whether it's the horse racing or sports book or casino games, I have a module that handles all of our SEO logic that's magical, and we just have to customize the code logic there so we can apply it to new sections. So large-scale websites, custom applications, dynamic content, or multiple data sources, that's the perfect use case for something that has a headless CMS. Whereas it's a small static website with infrequent updates, so something that you're not getting a live feed of information, or something that's a simple programmatic website, like Sally hasn't updated her data in like a year and a half or whatever, that's going to be on WordPress, that's fine. But if it's like a real-time data feed that scraped Google SERPs and scraped the ABS data, that might require more juice and more sophisticated architecture. So let's talk about a content management system that's part of the headless. So an example of headless is that you can have different databases for your content or the way the website's structured, but just as a content management system, you can have it. So there's a case study for Brighton SEO, which is very appropriate for an SEO one, where they build their platform on something called Next.js, which is a meta framework that I'll discuss later, and Sanity, which is a headless content management system. The website I work on uses Sanity. Sanity is the best content management system for headless platforms, but because it's a custom content management system, it's only as good as you customize it, if that makes sense. So out of the box, like if you use WordPress and you're used to having stuff like Elementor or like WP Bakery as like landing page builders, that's fantastic. Doing that manually in Sanity sucks. Like you have to code it up. So if your developers don't know how to code Sanity, you're gonna have a really terrible experience. But essentially what the thing that the main people here, it's been a while since I did the presentation, but they said that the reason why they built the Brighton SEO website in Sanity and Next.js is that they couldn't do what they wanted to do in WordPress. They wanted the flexibility to structure the content so that it could be like reusable parts and also automate schema generation based on the structure of how they design it. You're essentially modeling the content, and then you have these little blocks, and then they'll output it in the way you control. So if you have a business case for it, and the way you structure it, you have multiple stakeholders that might be involved, it is a perfect use case for you. Like, and even in modern day, it's starting to get easier and easier. The barrier of entry is getting lower and lower, so you don't even have to do it with large web applications. There could be templates where you could have a Next.js starter kit with Sanity, for example, or even any other numerous headless content management systems. So let's talk about the ecosystems. This is where it gets a little bit technical to understand why headless became a thing. So we're going to talk about the popular frameworks, the meta frameworks, which is confusing because I always refer to these as frameworks, but technically they're frameworks within a framework, and then the agnostic approach of how you would design these systems. So people who are familiar with frameworks, these is the JavaScript frameworks that power the modern web. Back when I started in 2011, when I got my first job, like jQuery was the thing to make stuff interactive. These days, we have these powerful libraries of JavaScript frameworks to make the web more like an app. Because if you remember when apps first became a thing way back in 2009 and 2008, the main thing was it was a really, really cool experience, smooth transitions. They remembered if you opened a menu or not, those kind of things, whereas the web sucked because the web had to reload. It was static, it kind of sucked. Well, Facebook got their little mitts out there and created something called React. React is a framework where it takes JavaScript, which is what causes interactivity in the web, and it is the most powerful modern framework in the world. React allows for dynamic presentation of content, filtering of lists, so when you on a list of an e-commerce website, you apply some filters and it does a really cool, smooth transition without refreshing the whole page. React was the pioneer of this kind of stuff, bringing the app-like experience into the web, making websites into web applications, fundamentally. But they do that with a component-based architecture, with a virtual DOM. It's been around since 2013, I think, and has the largest ecosystem. But React's not the only game in town. You have Vue.js, very popular in China, and people who want an alternative to React. It's probably the most popular alternative to React. React has a lot of engineering, like there's a lot of opinions within the engineering community, and Vue can be superior to React in certain instances, or just from an experience standpoint, or people just like to use what they like to use. You have Svelte, which is my personal favorite framework. This is a compile time framework, so it doesn't have what is called the virtual DOM, which is essentially takes a snapshot of the web page, and then when you do something, you get your change, and it looks at the difference, like you're working on a Google Doc, and it blends them all together, which is why that has a smooth experience. That's overhead. So Svelte was like, you don't need to do that. You can do that with other more efficient techniques. And the reason why I like Svelte is because it's the most similar to plain HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. If you know how HTML works, you can write Svelte right now. Then you have some more other meta frameworks. These ones have way lower market share. So you have Solid, which is basically a version of React that's more like Svelte. But if you know how to write React, you can write a more efficient website in Solid that's better for SEO, fundamentally, or just performance. I shouldn't say just say SEO. I have to be more agnostic. And then you have Quick. Quick is like something that is more like the promise of what these meta frameworks could be, or like these frameworks could be. It's something that uses a different type of interactivity. It's called resumability, and it is probably the one that's technically the best for SEO, but it is a little bit niche, if that makes sense. There's always like a niche framework, like this is the best because some kind of hardcore engineering thing. But those kind of frameworks live on top of an individual web page. They don't necessarily, that's what we have client-side rendering. They do all the stuff dynamically, but they don't actually inform the architecture of a web application, which is why meta frameworks exist. So for the longest time, from like say 2013 to like 2018 to 2019, everyone complained about React apps. React apps were the client-side rendering problem. You had this rich app-like experience on the web, but it didn't load the content on view source. That was the fundamental problem for us as SEOs at the time. It still is today because people are still stuck in their ways, but it's gone away. And it's gone away because of these frameworks. Next.js is basically what React is now. If you look at all the versions of React, when they update, every new feature has been in support of Next.js. Next.js is based on React, but this is the one that controls your entire web application, like how URLs are structured, how content is rendered, anything that's optimized for performance. And that's debatable within the internal communities, but if you want to use an SEO optimized React website, typically you go to Next.js. So one of our websites, Kick, is on Next.js, that's for example. You have Nuxt, so that's basically what Next is, but for Vue, the other framework there, the second most popular one. So that's like, for example, the Metricon website I worked on way back in 2021 or 2022. SvelteKit, that's what one of our websites, stake.com, is built on. This is my favorite framework, just in general. Actually, Astro, the next one is, but like from a web application, it has the same benefits of a Next.js and Nuxt.js, but flavor-wise, it is the one that's out of the box, really easy to use for SEO. Like, you can build complicated web applications with it, but have really, really good URL architecture, and it's very, very powerful. But if you were to ask me which is the best one out of the box for SEO, that answer is Astro, and it will be Astro in the foreseeable future. Astro is server-side rendered and static-side generated, which I'll explain later, out of the box. You can look up a tutorial how to build an Astro website right now, and you'll build something that will be SEO friendly, 100% guaranteed. Like, essentially, this is a completely different approach. The other three that we talked about before were tied to those different languages. Next is married to React, Nuxt is married to Vue, SvelteKit is married to Svelte. Astro, you can use no framework on top of it, or you can use more than one. They have different concepts called islands. You can do entire talk on Astro, but Astro essentially is like, it is what you want it to be. It is the most flexible. It's probably the best for marketing type of websites, pamphlet type of websites. If you're not going to build something that has a complicated authentication and application experience, Astro is probably the best WordPress alternative on the list. Like, if you wanted to like learn JavaScript instead of PHP, and you asked me for a recommendation, I'd say build a website in Astro. And the final one is Remix, which is also an alternative to Next.js, which has an alternative opinion on what's called routing, which I'll explain. Routing is probably the single most important concept for SEOs other than server-side rendering for these frameworks, because it determines how you structure URL structure, which means how you handle things like redirects, or how you handle things like inheritance of URLs, categorization, those kind of things. That is one of the things that there, and it has an opposite philosophy of Next.js. In case you have a client, if you're an agency, or you want to experiment and say, which one do I use, Next or Remix, these are the things that you should explore. So these are all the tools that developers use to build fancy web applications in modern day. So how do you approach this? Because it's like, which do I use? What do you use? What do we do? And you have to think more about the philosophy is that it doesn't matter what you use, that's an engineering decision. You just have to think of them as toolbox, because the whole point of a decoupled system is that you should, in theory, be able to swap them out. So for example, before I started my role at stake.com, their website used to be built on React. They switched to SvelteKit. So this is a large architectural change, not a single URL changed, not one. Because all you're doing is keeping the same back-end technology, you're just switching the front-end technology. And that is the promise of decoupled systems. You can have what is a migration, but you're not moving from Magento to Shopify or something like that. You're moving a part of the architecture from one technology to another, and ideally your users should not read a hitch, it should just be better. So that's the actual goal. So that's why you have something that's API driven, is that you're taking a bunch of data, which is like the list of your games, the list of bets, all these services that your application would have, and you could change the technology that determines that, or you can change the technology that presents that. And if you did things right, you should not be impacted, or the only change will be whatever you wanted it to change. You want it to be better. And that is the promise there, where you can actually just say, okay, it's hard to hire Remix developers, we're switching to Next.js. That should be not an easy thing, it's still an architectural thing, but from the end user standpoint, they shouldn't even notice a thing unless it's a very deliberate change. You should be in control of that. And that is the promise of a decoupled system. You have microservices as an architecture. So you have services, they're like, for example, the sitemap service. This service here generates a list of my URLs, and that will be used for the sitemap. You can break this out into really granular parts. And that is the promise, is that you can have multiple sources of information. So you can have like, here's the list of the soccer games. Here's a list of the tennis games. But here's also a list of the users that bet. And you can have these little parts, and then you can just interchange those little services in there, and instead of having it all stuck in your PHP framework or that kind of stuff. That is the approach of it. You can even use different coding languages. You can build one service in a language called Go. You could build one in Rust. The developer likes this, so he's going to mess around. Companies like Telstra do this all the time, where they just have like different developers on different teams doing different languages, and it doesn't matter for the end user. You have headless CMS platforms. So for example, you as the engineer can design how the content authoring experience is managed. And that is the main advantages there. But the things that is hard as us as SEO is that you have to do everything from scratch unless there's an established boilerplate for it. So this is not even true for SEO. This is true for analytics. This is true for paid marketing. This is true for anything that involves marketing or something that's not within core IT infrastructure. You either have to know this is the GitHub library that does this out of the box. So for example, in Next.js, there's something called Next SEO, which does a lot of SEO features out of the box, or you have to tell the engineers how to design it from scratch. And you, as an SEO, you have to also inform how URLs are structured in something that is a distributed system. So you might not know what the possible URLs can be if you don't know what the sources of data can be and what even the goal is. And you also have to do performance optimization. That's one of the biggest problems with headless architecture platforms. So here's an example of a migration that happened with a headless architecture. So the website kick.com was launched very, very quickly in October of 2022, I'm going to say. Hopefully, and maybe November was the launch date. But long story short, Twitch banned gambling. What are we going to do as a company? Let's build a Twitch competitor. So that's what my company does. So what ended up happening is we created a top 200 website in the world. And we got all of the Twitch's largest streamers, paid them a stupid amount of money, and they came to our platform. But in order to launch a website that big, that quickly, it had to be very ad hoc, right? So it was in what's called beta for like a year and a half. And that version of the platform was built on something called Laravel, which is a PHP framework, and Vue.js. Vue.js is the framework that is the alternative to React. That's the engineers that were hired to build this website, built it very quickly, and they had a preferred technology stack. This website is probably the worst website from an SEO standpoint in human history. Everything client-side rendered, that kind of stuff. But because brand is so strong, Google persisted. The little trooper crawled, was able to see Aiden Ross's kick page, and those URLs, even though they had no custom metadata and the chat logs were sometimes rendering the metadata and be awful and bad for our brand, the pages got into Google. So this is what it was like when it was on Nuxt.js. So it still persisted. I mean, it wasn't on Nuxt. Actually, Nuxt was the bad one. So bad SEO, Google still persisted. But we could have been better if we had time or if it was easy. But when we switched to Next.js, the one you want to focus on is the graph on the bottom, which is the total amount of keywords. So like the actual volume of keywords started increasing because it's actually now server-side rendered. And now it actually has some mechanical stuff from SEO. I still don't do anything for content there. It's all purely mechanical, but we didn't have to change a single URL. We didn't have to perform a single redirect. This is a major architectural change. We changed the front end and the back end with some parts of the old back end still in there. It's to this day, some parts of Laravel still in there. We changed it to Next.js, which is the meta framework for React. But we also changed the back end to mostly Go, but that is a slow and ongoing process where we're just swapping out individual services to the new one because so many things are tied to individual user accounts. But we didn't drop a single page. Like even though our old website was bad, we didn't actually have the impact of URL because it's going from one headless architecture to another. It was just a technology change, and it has better SEO now, but it wasn't as big as that one. That is the promise of having a flexible architecture like this is that you can make a change and you can have what is the same URLs, different presentation, different technology, different everything, like different needs of engineers who can work on it, because now our engineers can work on this new technology where before this was entirely contracted out. And we didn't miss a beat, and we were able to just say, okay, here's the improvements that we want. And then soon we'll be able to add more stuff and keep iterating on that, and we can actually do real SEO for the website. But it's very mechanical, and just we're having server-side rendering and those kind of things, the amount of keywords improved for that. It's more like a social media website because it's a UGC platform, right? So we're more like competing with the likes of Twitter for like individual streams names than we are with anything else. Like I don't optimize for best streamers online or whatever. That's like 300 keyword searches a month or whatever. So the other thing we have to talk about is the rendering paradigms. Earlier we had that technical SEO panel, and we discussed things like client-side rendering versus server-side rendering. Like one of the things I mentioned casually was hydration and resumability. So I'm going to talk about like what is CSR versus SSR, but also what is the more advanced rendering frameworks. So the rendering paradigms. So traditionally, websites would load like fully. Like you load the HTML, it relies on the server to actually render it on the page, and that is what we call server-side rendering. So your WordPress website and that kind of stuff. You have also client-side rendering, which is the bane of all the SEOs in the room, where the website will have a piece of HTML on it, but then you're relying on JavaScript to load all of the presentation and content dynamically, and then it will load, which takes time, and you're relying on external files. And you also have static site generation, which is essentially you produce the HTML of the website ahead of time. So for a very small website, you can just build it out, and that is server-side rendered, but also just like the whole HTML. You're not loading anything else except for the full page experience. These are the fastest websites known to man, just pure cached HTML, beautiful. But there are actually more advanced approaches because it is 2025 now. We've had a solid decade plus of iterating on this to improve user experience, to have the best of both worlds, so people can have the interactive, rich, app-like experience when they're browsing a website, but you can also have it where it performs from just a speed standpoint, but also from an organic search standpoint. So we have hydration. Hydration adds interactivity to existing server-side rendered content. So you have server-side rendered content, but you have little listeners to make stuff that is more dynamic. You have incremental static regeneration, ISR, which is static site generation, but a little bit interactive. And then you have islands, which is what Astro does, which is where you can have mix and match technology into different parts of the website. And there's also resumability. So to go over it, benefits, server-side render is great, client-side render is bad. Like I'll go over this kind of stuff, but I think I've already kind of explained it earlier on. But faster page versus slower page and more flaws and dependencies. So this is what hydration looks like. Hydration is a solution that is a little bit more modern. You see here we have pages where on the left this is client-side rendered, and on the right this is where hydration happens. So instead of loading the entire page with interactive elements, only the parts that are actually interactive will be listening for interaction. So you can still do the benefits of server-side rendering, but you still have the benefits of what is complicated web architecture, and you'll be able to make it resume. So you pre-send the HTML over the wire, and then client-side, the client-side rendering doesn't render the whole page. It only renders the part where it's actually going to be interacted with. And this is one of the best solutions for dynamic websites. It's having your cake and eating it too. So when you talk to an engineer that says it's client-side rendered, you say, why don't you hydrate X, Y, and Z? Like if it's only the add to cart button and this stuff, that should be the interactive part. Why are you dynamically rendering my content when the content never changes? The content is static. That's a waste of resources to load it dynamically every single time. There is some cons. It could be like slower time to interact if you care about core web vitals. I don't, you know my opinion on that. And many, many frameworks do hydration these days. We're in a quite mature space for this. The other one's resumability. Resumability is really, really cool, but it's only available in like a very limited framework. This means that server renders JavaScript when it needs to. So when you actually are able to add the cart, then it adds the dynamic part, and then it does the cool things there. This is only available in a framework called Quick, but this is like the best of both worlds, is that you have a perfect application that has all the dynamic parts, but only uses the complicated JavaScript when it needs to. And that is available on a framework called Quick, which is alternative to React. That's awesome and improves, like Core Web Vitals, it's like they brag about having perfect Core Web Vitals and all those TTI stats and stuff like that. So if you want to experiment, do that. Just bear in mind with these experimental frameworks that they have very, very low usage. And when you're discussing with engineers of how to do framework design, you want to just keep the most important elements. So for SSR, SSG, and cache, title tags, meta description, canonicals, href flags, anything that's in the head should always be server-side rendered regardless. These are the things that are most important, like from the needle standpoint. Like this is where you would fight tooth and nail and say, this is critical. I can't do SEO without this. I have to explain why it's important, but everyone knows why they're important in this conference. From a hierarchy standpoint, if you had to pick and choose what to render dynamically and what to render server-side, ideally everything, that's why server-side render is great, but if you had to hydrate, anything that's your primary content, so like your menus or your main content of the page should be server-side rendered. If there's secondary information that is like maybe dynamic or maybe not actually critical for ranking of that page, you can live without it. You can concede the battle with engineering, or Google can wait and eventually load if it doesn't change that much. Just pick and choose your battles if it requires that, and just say this is critical in that one. And for content, just default for hydration. Just make sure like anything that's static should just be rendered server-side rendered. And handle personalized content like that kind of way. And best practice, just server-side, just critical elements. So pretty basic there. One of the things that's really important to discuss, though, is routing. Routing is the thing I've never heard any other SEO talk about, and it's the single most important thing that, as an SEO, that I do when working on a large application. So I'll talk about file-based versus config-based routing. I'll give one specific example and also some SEO considerations. And I actually have no idea how I'm going for time because I did not rehearse this, but like just give me a wrap-up and I can breeze through some stuff. So there are two different types of routing when you have large application architectures. You have config-based routing, which is what most of you will be used to. This just means that all the information on how URLs and routes are structured are stored in the one place. This might be your htaccess file that WordPress does for you, for example. This means that doing redirects is easy because you can say this redirects to that thing. And it's all in one place. It could be one giant file. And that's flexible, it's easy to understand, and it's all centralized. And it makes our jobs as SEO easy. These frameworks don't do that. They use something called file-based routing. So file-based routing is very intuitive. It's basically you create a folder, and that's the folder in the application. So anything that's under /sports, that's my sports section. And then sports / a template name for like the sport itself could be sports soccer, sports basketball. That uses the same template. So when the developers are building it, they just add folders, add files, and that's how they structure an application. So very intuitive to understand from a coding standpoint, but it actually causes issues when you want to do something as simple as a redirect manager, or something like which URL or where to add something to make a change. So there are two different pros and cons. So here's like an advanced example in SvelteKit. So this is the example I use for a very specific Argentinian Copa Libertadores, like for them to win. Basically, it's like an article that Argentina will win the Copa Libertadores. 5 minutes? Okay, excellent, thank you. So, you have a hierarchy that you have to wrestle with. So if I wanted to apply some rules to this one, it has to be in this specific folder in the application. But if this folder doesn't exist, then it has to meet a bunch of other rules. This is where it gets hard because you have no idea where in the code a problem exists. So you could have a problem in the article template, which is here, because this matches that rule there. So if this doesn't exist, but it'll trigger this one. You could have one in the catch-all for the entire website, because that could be a site-wide issue. And you could have one for just the language one as well for sports. This is sports, this is a catch-all. And this one doesn't match because it doesn't meet the criteria. So like they have all these like matching rules, and you have to either identify issues or do other kind of things. This makes stuff like redirects very difficult. Like you wouldn't be able to know what triggers a redirect because you don't know what file is triggering the rule for the redirect. All right, so I've got that kind of stuff. So let's just talk about very, very briefly, and I'll kind of power through it because we'll talk about like what you have to do as an SEO to build it from scratch. So out of the box, you need to do the most important stuff and communicate that to engineering. So you need to do stuff like the robots.txt, the XML sitemap, how to do header responses. One of the most common issues is that you can't get a 404 on these custom web applications because the engineers produce the page regardless and they don't actually do the server response. Because if an API, which is the information, might be broken, the web page itself is separate from the backend. So they just say the 200 page, content not found. Or like, this page is not available, but the server response is 200. So you have to tell them, hey, if there's no information coming through, server 404 response. These are the kind of things that you have to do from scratch and just educate the engineers that this is important for core management, for information management. You have to do all the header elements and those kind of things. So this is the example of like how you would structure like an SEO element. I think this is from Next SEO. I have something very similar from our website, which is a massive SEO element that handles all the SEO logic from schema, structured data, those kind of things, like 18 different things that are all controlled under this one massive component. And you have to make sure you balance stuff that's statically generated and that kind of stuff. And it requires building stuff from scratch. There's no magical plugin. I mean, there might be some libraries that help you out, but there's no magical plugin like WordPress to solve these problems. So build the things from scratch. Make sure you get the sitemaps generated. You do that from the file-based architecture, split it out, do good things. Make sure you control the head. Make sure that you also generate schema and you use the information that's available. I won't go into the details for them, but that's essentially the SEO basics and fundamentals. You have to communicate how to do it in a complex web application. This is an example for e-commerce, but there's essentially no solutions out of the box, but you can do some stuff there. This was a slide by someone else. I should have deleted it because they were supposed to talk about that. And also the third and final thing, and I'll breeze through this part, is cost of ownership. It is just very, very difficult to do it because essentially it's a specialized skill set. It is rapid changes in technology because I mentioned you can switch technology. Technologies have different flavors and engineers have different preferences. You have to have a broad understanding of different needs. And it's a continuous learning process. So you have technical debt as well. So sometimes you might have one part of the architecture that's really out of date, that's really important to fix, but it might take a while. It took us 1.5 years to switch from the first version of the Kik website to the second version of the website. And you have to make it sustainable. And change is hard. There's so many pitfalls because even doing a reorganization of URLs can be tricky. Like the benefits is that you can keep everything the same, but change might be hard, for example. And so there's ways you can do this. You can do this with phase rollouts. You can maintain old systems in the same time as new systems. You can analyze impact and then implement something and monitor it for like your predicted period of say 2 weeks of impact and then recover. And then you have automated systems to monitor stuff, so logging and that kind of stuff. But generally, all concepts of SEO is agnostic. You just have to break it out into different parts and meet every single pillar. So your on-site, your technical, your content, your off-site, and your keyword research is the foundation. And in conclusion, everything has a very, very important and powerful ecosystem. There's a lot of technological change, and the stuff that you have to understand is how the rendering paradigms are available to you and how to do routing and architecture and communicate that to engineers. But that's kind of it, and I've run over time, but that is questions and answers, and thank you all.